This is Caleb the Mechanic of Radio Free Catholic. Let's go ahead and get started with a prayer. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Sancta Michael Arcangele, defende nos in proelio, contra nequitiam et insidias diaboli est oppressidium. Imperet illi Deus, supplices deprecamur, tuque princeps militae caelestis, satana maliosque spiritus malignos, qui ad perditionem animarem, pervegantur in mundo divina virtute, in infernum detrude. Amen. Our Lady of Sorrows, pray for us. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. So, today is going to be a two-part. This is actually going to be a two-part. It's actually going to be all one podcast. There's going to be two segments in it. In the first segment, I want to talk about a phrase that I've noticed is coming up in common parlance that reminds me of a role-playing game that I play called Mage the Ascension. That phrase, or that word, is technocracy. I was reminded of it reading a blog post by Padre Peregrino, Father David Nix, where he actually uses the phrase technocratic communism. The first part, I'm going to talk about that, and then the next part, I'm actually going to talk about his blog, because it's a very, very good blog, and it's a very important blog for us today in the Catholic world, given what's going on with the virus and our governments and the overall civil strife that seems to be taking place. The first part, on occasion, I'm a storyteller for a game called Mage the Ascension. It's an older game. I think it came out in early to mid-90s, so it's about 20-25 years old. It is a well-researched game. The writers, the creator, Mark Ryan Hagan, did a fantastic job researching the game and kind of putting together how everything was supposed to work. The concept is that the players all play magicians. And we're not talking like sleight of hand magicians, although sometimes there's a little bit of sleight of hand going on in there. But we're talking about legitimate thaumaturges. Men and women who can reshape reality with their thoughts. Generally games like this, particularly if you happen to not be particularly mature, can actually lead you down the path into the occult and actually cause some serious damage. I didn't actually start playing this game until right about a year before I reverted back to Catholicism. And by then, I'd already spent a lot of time in the occult. I'd already spent a lot of time dealing with witches and demons and spirits and the whole occult gamut. By the time I started playing the game, I was 20 years a Christian, mostly as a Protestant evangelical, and as I said, it was about a year before I reverted to Catholicism. And when I reverted to Catholicism, it actually changed my entire worldview as to how the game should be played. The key point of the game, because they don't really get into too much of the religious stuff, it's more a modern game of sorcery, of that sort of thing. And so when you overlay it on a template, particularly if you happen to be playing with a bunch of Catholics, a lot of the themes can stand out beautifully. The basic premise of the game is that your players are usually members of what they call the traditions, which are the various forms of magical tradition that are purported to be throughout human history. On the other side of the fence is the enemy, which is called the Technocratic Union. This is very much a geopolitical game. It's not too heavy into local politics, although sometimes that plays in it. It's not too much into religion, although when you're playing with a framework that is deeply religious, it actually, as I said, it adds a special depth and color to the game. The technocratic union happens to be the thing that's standing out in my mind, because as I played this game for several years, I sort of automatically knee-jerk. When someone says technocracy, I know that they are generally the enemy. Not because they're evil people, but because their ideas are totalitarian, authoritarian, fascistic, communistic, Marxist. In general, the flaws sort of bubble up to the surface in humanity, and you can see genuinely good-intentioned people do absolutely horrifying things, all because of the fact that they wish to be the ones to determine the rules that reality operates in. Now, if you're Catholic, the idea of a person determining the rules that reality operates in, it should already be jumping out at you that that's a bad thing. And it's not to say that the tradition mages are any better, because the whole point is that they fought a war for the Ascension. The traditions just lost. At least when you come into the game at that point, the traditions have lost the war. They've had lost the war for the better part of 200 or 300 years. And so you're a tradition mage who's surrounded on all sides by people who believe that science is the only God. Can you see the issue? Can you see the reason why I would enjoy a game such as this? It's interesting because if you don't play the game well, which is to say, when you create the character that you're going to be playing, if you don't actually put yourself in their position, then you're never going to see some of the truly amazing, deep moments that happen. And the nice thing about this game is that, unlike in the real world, killing people is only on paper. It's not actually a real thing that you're doing. But if you really immerse yourself in the game, you can learn many of life's lessons without firing a shot or drawing your sword for real. And this is probably the one thing that makes me very much an enthusiast of the tabletop RPG genre. Now, I'm not particularly a fan of Dungeons & Dragons, in part because it's very difficult to put yourself in the mental position of a bunch of numbers. It is also very much more pagan. Not in its original design. A lot of people forget that Dungeons & Dragons was created by Christians. And the idea was to gather the family around the table and get them away from the television. In that, I would argue, Dungeons & Dragons is probably one of the better tools for building the family, the actual family life. However, it does have some severe limitations. It has been carried on for about 40 or 50 years, and the people who design the game now are not the Christians who designed the game originally. So there's more error and less room for truth, really. This game allowed me to explore avenues of approach and patterns of living that I certainly would not recommend doing in real life. But at the same time, too, as I said, you get to learn the lessons without actually doing it, and whether or not you succeed can be largely a function of how the dice roll. In that, it's very much like Ecclesiastes. The race doesn't go to the swift, nor the battle to the strong. If you get an opportunity to pick up a game like this and explore the world that they create, it's very easy, particularly because they have a whole section on how to apply what they've done to your worldview as a storyteller, and also as a player, how to apply playing a character with the worldview that you choose, and figuring out what the best course of action is, or at least what the course of action is to live, to fight the next day, to try and do the next battle. I think one of my favorite aspects of that game is the fact that all action, if you have a very good storyteller, all of your actions have consequences, is quite a beautiful thing. The story, however, puts people of tradition versus technocratic authority. And that is a perfect parallel to what the world looks like today. Before I switch over to the next segment, I'd like to remind you to take a moment and favorite this podcast on Anchor.fm, and contemplate maybe sponsoring the podcast. I could definitely use the help. It'll allow me to spend a little bit more time working on the research that I want to do for the podcast to be able to actually make educated commentary. Otherwise, I have to spend most of my time doing other stuff in order to try and make ends meet. Also, share the podcast, because the more people who who listen to the podcast or see the videos on YouTube. And by the way, I have videos. I do post videos to YouTube, and I've begun posting videos to BitChute. So you can also actually sit and watch videos. It's mostly the same audio stuff. And as I get better with the video editing, I'll be able to actually put more of the references that I'm talking about on the screen. So this way, I'm not making it up. However, I do try to remember to cite as many sources as possible. Although some of the stuff on Catholic doctrine, I mean, obviously you can find most of that stuff in the books on Catholic social teaching, the Catechism of the Catholic Church. I reference very heavily from the Catechism of Trent, and also from the teachings of homilies and conferences by priests like Father Ripperger or Father Wolf, both of whom feature rather heavily on Sensus Fidelium. Father David Nix. Obviously, the Padre Peregrino blog is very heavily cited. LifeSite News, Remnant newspaper, Church Militant. I try to pull through and make sure that I give the hat tips to the people who are responsible for my podcast. But like I said, there are a lot of ways you can support. Money doesn't hurt, but sharing the podcast helps a lot. Tweeting us on Twitter, and getting a little bit more exposure would be great. I can also use the followers, so at least people know when these podcasts are coming out. But if you favorite the podcast, then chances are you'll actually find out when each Anchor.fm podcast comes out. And obviously, subscribing and getting notifications on YouTube will do the same. With that, we're going to go ahead and break for a quick word on Anchor.fm. It should be Anchor.fm. And I will see you in part 2 here in about another minute. So if you're watching the video, it would not be Anchor.fm. Well, actually, it should be Anchor.fm. So we'll go ahead and do one for Anchor.fm. The Anchor.fm is actually a really easy-to-use podcast platform. If you happen to be a Catholic voice, then we definitely need your voice added to the greater mix. Particularly, it's nice to actually, when I look across the platforms, I see a lot of different expertises coming out of the different podcasters. So you've got some theologians, you've got obviously a lot of priests, you've got people who do a lot of research and who are willing to bring you current events and stuff. And I try to focus on the more big picture operations, things that are sort of the intersection with the secular world and the Catholic world, from a more military national security type perspective. Obviously, we need more voices. So if you can find another niche to fit in, then Anchor.fm I think would be the place to go. It's really easy, it's free, and the tools that you have on it and the exposure that you get. I think I'm on 8 different platforms, including Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts, Spotify, and several others. So it's definitely an easy way to gain some decent exposure People manage to search for these things all the time. And most importantly, actually, I'd like the fact that it's free and it's easy to use. So again, swing on over to anchor.fm or download the app, and it'll basically walk you through everything that you need to know. It's a really good app. Now back to the show. Okay, so continuing with part 2 from PadrePeregrino.org. Special thanks and hat tip to Father David Nix, because had he not written about it, honestly, I don't think I would have caught it, because I don't really track a whole lot of information coming out of New Zealand. The beginning of the article, he cites a tweet from Disclose.tv, which looks to be a minute-long clip, approximately a minute-long clip, where they basically, the New Zealand government mentions that they have quarantine camps, where, quote, mandatory quarantine will apply to both new cases and, if necessary, close family members who might be at risk, close quote, with forced removal from your home if you do not comply. Kind of a big deal. This is in May. Starting in May, New Zealand reported 0 new coronavirus cases Monday, for the first time since the middle of March, and still, with all the international over-reporting, they were only able to muster up 20 alleged deaths due to coronavirus. Now, let's grant that to them, and God rest their souls, but now they're claiming only 13 positive cases in 4 days. And that's 13 positive cases in 4 days, which is actually just 4 people with a generic test that turned positive, and doesn't necessarily mean that they actually have the disease. And this apparently was the reason that they opened quarantine camps. He puts a chart on there. Total cases, 1,258. Total new cases, 7. Total deaths, 22. I'm unsure what the population of New Zealand is. I thought it was in the 10 to 20 million. I could be mistaken. I don't know what the population is, but I do know that when it comes to percentages, 7, even if it's only 1 million, 7 new cases out of 1 million people. That's not really pandemic level. And yet, for some reason, they came up with a quarantine camp as an idea. And CNN, apparently, accidentally, had an opening line to this story as, quote, a man in his 50s absconded from a New Zealand quarantine facility, cutting through a fence to visit a liquor store, officials revealed on Friday. Now, if you've never been involved with the justice system, then you probably don't know the context of the word absconded in this sentence. And if you do, I don't mean to talk down to you, but for those who don't know what the word absconded means, it means escaped. He escaped the facility. He left the facility without permission, essentially. Now, Father Dave Nix brings up 2 very important questions, and I'm going to quote these directly. First, why is a wire fence necessary for a quote-unquote voluntary hotel clinic? Because they do actually talk about how this is supposed to be a voluntary quarantine. Second, how could a man languishing and debilitated under the deadly virus have the strength to break through a fence to go purchase some booze? Now, if this was China, okay. If it was Russia, I'd still be kind of leery about it, but I'd look at it and be like, all right, it's Russia. You know, it's not exactly, they're not exactly built on English common law. But we are talking about New Zealand. And if you've ever met a Kiwi, then you'll know that these are some of the most fun people on the earth. They've got an excellent sense of humor, and they are very much similar to Americans in their desire to be free, to live their life and kind of do the thing, and in general, generally cooperative with authority, etc. Like they're very much. I mean, aside from the accent, there's not a whole lot of difference between an American and a New Zealander. I mean, there's some outlook things that make for some funny translation, but we're not talking. But this is not, like I said, this is not China. This is not some totalitarian regime like the Islamofascist state of Iran. This is New Zealand, ostensibly a pretty chill place. I mean, the pictures I've seen of New Zealand, this place is paradise. It's beautiful. So it's a little on the weird side that they would have quarantine camps that are basically, I mean, you change the word. The bottom line is that you have a camp that you can't leave, which sounds like a freaking concentration camp to me. And Father Nix actually brings this up. It's like, how is it that, you see the story, and the first question isn't why do they have concentration camps? It's, what did he go buy? The guy broke out and went to the liquor store. What did he buy? They're more interested in what he bought to drink at the liquor store than they are in the fact that he was imprisoned, effectively. And they have security, and they have what is it? Oh, let me pull another quote out of here, because this blog is actually kind of a direct response to a conversation he had. Yeah, I'll just read this paragraph out, and you can kind of figure it out. Quote, notice that this gentleman from New Zealand, and we have over 500 friends in the traditional Catholic world on Facebook, so he's certainly a conservative or even traditional Catholic, is defending the mandatory camps in claiming in the exact same sentence that it is both, quote, voluntary, so that nobody attempts to escape. Those words were in the same sentence. That Kiwi conservative Catholic who wrote the public admonition against me for using the term concentration camp also defended his country's quarantine facilities by insisting they needed, quote, improved security and guarding, close quote. And those were the respondent, not Father Nix. Now, improved security, let's be real for a moment. Who's breaking into a facility where people are sick? So clearly the security is not to keep people out. So why would you have improved security to keep people in if it's voluntary? Why would you be okay with the idea that you have a containment center for people? Particularly for a disease where it's very controversial as to what the final effects of this disease are going to be that were not self-made by our governments and our churches. The virus itself, it's a virus, but the overall danger level doesn't seem to be getting out into the media, and there's a lot of controversy as to how to treat it and all that other stuff. And the bottom line is that we just don't have the solid data to give real results. And so we could be blowing this thing completely out of proportion. And it sounds, the more I watch the news, like that's exactly what we're doing, is blowing this thing way out of proportion. Why would we not be concerned about concentration camps? Why would we not be concerned about prison camps for the ill? And I use the word prison camp because if you can't leave, then you would be kidnapped, except it's your government doing it, so it's prison. And it's that simple. Father Nix actually mentions the answer pretty simple. I'm going to go ahead and continue to quote. Catholics are obedient. Lay Catholics fall in line with their parish priests, who fall in line with their bishops, who are being paid millions by their government in 2020 to stay silent and keep their churches closed. Close quote. This is the issue that I have when it comes to technocracy. Instead of a meritocracy where people who are legitimately competent do well, and instead of I'm not a huge fan of democracy. I'm more of a fan of democracy to any totalitarianism, but democracy tends to descend into totalitarianism, and most particularly, it's easy to do when the democracy surrenders to the technocrat. He points out that Catholics today are sounding as dumb as the Russian Orthodox 70 years ago, when they were being hauled into gulags by the Soviet Union. He mentions, or he actually, quote, because our governors and hierarchy would never lie to us, close quote, which we obviously know is not true. But and he mentions this, if you read the very recent history of Venezuela, or the history of Russia, or even Nazi Germany, dare I say it, or Maoist China, it happens the same way every time. Ultimately, we're made to follow a leader. And the only real difference this time is that it's happening everywhere all at once. Except maybe South Dakota. But California, New York, even my home state of Colorado, and to a degree, even my last state in Indiana. I mean, they're arresting people for opening their businesses in New Jersey and North Carolina and Texas, of all places. And they're not giving reasons, not actual reasons based on real science. And even if there were reasons based on real science, how about getting the message at least somewhat continuous? And at the same time, and this is probably the thing that's really missing from Father Dave's analysis, and it's not the focus of what he's talking about, so I'm definitely not going to hold it against him. Alongside all of those governmental takeovers where the people were enslaved and major atrocities were committed against the human person all over the world in all of these cases, alongside them were heavy amounts of discord and anarchy, were huge protests where reason goes out the window and emotion takes fully over. The protests in Portland and St. Louis, in Richmond, Virginia, in Washington and New York. The protesters are all saying you will bow down and obey us, even though they don't have a coherent ideology that can be seen, except for the one that wants to destroy everything that our nation has managed to build, and even that we've not only our nation has managed to build in the last 200 years, but what we've done for the world in the last century. See, a lot of people forget that poverty in the rest of the world was huge. That we've always been at the leading edge of the most comfortable life. But in the last 50 years in particular, more people have been elevated out of poverty by the results of what America has done. And not just America, but what she's done with her allies, like the UK, like Europe. We've done some amazing things, wonderful things. And it seems like now, one portion of the country, and I'd say the world, wants to destroy that. And the other part wants to use the destroyers to try and gain control. And control of nature is always the goal of the technocrat, never of God. Because it's actually God that's in control. So as we continue to watch these technocrats, this technocracy where we try to follow the experts' advice, even though they're just as pinheaded as the rest of us, really, we're actually lining ourselves up against God. And as Catholics, we need to wake up to that, and we need to wake up to that fast. Because our bishops are paid. Like Judas Iscariot, who would surrender the body of our Lord, our bishops are paid so that they may clearly surrender the mystical body of Christ. This is Caleb the Mechanic with Radio Free Catholic. May God bless you and the Virgin protect you. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.